The thunder of hooves against the parched earth was the only warning Grace Collins had before the dust cloud materialized into the form of a man on horseback, his silhouette stark against the setting sun of the Montana Territory. 1878. She stood frozen on the porch of her small schoolhouse, clutching her lesson plans to her chest as if they might shield her from whatever trouble galloped her way. In the 3 years she had been teaching at the Whispering Pines schoolhouse, she had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. The rider slowed his chestnut stallion, revealing a weathered face beneath the shadow of his Stetson. Beside him, a smaller horse trotted, carrying a boy no older than 8, his face a miniature version of the man's, same strong jaw, same determined eyes. "Miss Collins." The man's voice was deep, rough like the terrain he'd clearly spent his life navigating. "Name's Rylan Ingram." "This here's my son, Thomas." Grace nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Rylan Ingram was not unknown to her. The widowed rancher had taken over the Double R Ranch last spring after the passing of his uncle. She'd heard stories of his skill with horses, his fair dealings with his hands, and the devoted way he raised his son alone after his wife died giving birth. But they'd never formally met. Until now. "Mr. Ingram," she managed, setting her papers down on the bench beside her. "What brings you to the schoolhouse at this hour?" Thomas Ingram fidgeted atop his pony, his eyes wide with what appeared to be nervous excitement. "Pa says I'm to start school next week," he blurted out, unable to contain himself. "Says a boy needs proper learning." A faint smile tugged at Ryland's lips as he dismounted in one fluid motion, the movement betraying years of life in the saddle. "That's right. Been teaching him what I can, but arithmetic ain't my strong suit, and his reading could use a proper hand." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-warmed earth. "Wanted to introduce ourselves proper before Monday." Grace smoothed her skirts, a habit when she felt uncertain. "Well, I'm pleased to meet you both. We're looking forward to having Thomas join us." She turned her gaze to the boy. "We just started learning about explorers. I think you'll find it fascinating." Thomas beamed, revealing a missing front tooth. "I already know about Lewis and Clark. Pa's got books." "Trying to give him what his ma would have wanted," Ryland said softly, and Grace caught the flash of pain in his eyes, a wound still raw despite the passing years. The mention of Thomas's mother sent a pang through Grace. She understood loss all too well. 2 years ago, she'd buried her fiancé, a cavalryman who died in a skirmish with raiders. Teaching had become her salvation, a way to build a life from the ruins of her dreams. "That's admirable, Mr. Ingram. Education is a gift that lasts a lifetime." Ryland nodded, then cleared his throat. "Actually, there's another reason we came by. Town's having a harvest social next Saturday." Thomas here thought, "Well, what Pa's trying to say," Thomas interrupted with the bold confidence only children possess, "is that he wanted to ask if you'd save him a dance at the social." The boy grinned mischievously. "He's been practicing." Color flooded Ryland's face as he gave his son a look that mingled embarrassment with fond exasperation. "Thomas." Grace felt warmth rise to her own cheeks. In a town where eligible women were scarce, she'd grown accustomed to polite advances. Yet something about the awkward way this proud man stood before her, betrayed by his own son's candor, touched her in a way previous suitors hadn't. "I'd be honored, Mr. Ingram," she said, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Though I should warn you, I have 2 left feet." Relief washed over his face. "Then we'll make a fine pair, Miss Collins, as I've been blessed with the same affliction." Thomas rolled his eyes in the dramatic fashion only children can perfect. "You ain't that bad, Pa. Miss Jenkins said you danced real nice at the 4th of July celebration." Ryland coughed, obviously mortified. Well, we should get going. Got chores waiting and a long ride back. He settled his hat back on his head. Thank you kindly, Miss Collins, for everything. As they mounted their horses, Grace felt something flutter in her chest, something she hadn't felt since before the telegram that had shattered her world. Until Saturday, Mr. Ingram, she called after them. And Thomas, I'll have your desk ready Monday morning. The boy waved enthusiastically while his father nodded, his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary before they turned and rode away, leaving Grace standing on the schoolhouse steps, watching until they disappeared beyond the bend, wondering why her heart was suddenly beating so fast. The next morning, Grace arrived at the schoolhouse earlier than usual. She wanted to prepare Thomas's desk and reading materials before her other 12 students arrived. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and as she unlocked the schoolhouse door, she found herself humming a tune she hadn't hummed in years. Inside, she moved between the rows of desks, straightening slates and checking chalk supplies. When she reached an empty desk near the windows, she paused. This would be perfect for Thomas, close enough to the front that she could keep an eye on him, but with a view of the open plains that might ease a ranch boy's transition to indoor learning. As she arranged primers and writing materials, the schoolhouse door creaked open. Grace looked up, expecting one of her early arriving students, but instead found Penny Watson, the postmistress's daughter and the town's most reliable source of gossip. "Good morning, Penny," Grace said, straightening. "What brings you by so early?" Penny, a plump woman with perpetually pink cheeks, bustled in with barely contained excitement. "Just thought you'd like to know you're the talk of the town this morning." She deposited a small package on Grace's desk. "Ma asked me to deliver this slate to you, and I figured I'd bring the news along with it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "News? About Rylan Ingram calling on you yesterday?" Penny clasped her hands together. "Half the women in this territory have set their caps for him since he arrived, but he hasn't shown interest in any of them. Then, suddenly, he's riding all the way out to your schoolhouse." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "And asking you to the harvest social, no less." Grace felt her cheeks warm. He was enrolling his son in school, Penny. The social was merely an afterthought. Penny waved a dismissive hand. "That's not how Millie Carson tells it. She was collecting herbs by the creek and saw the whole thing. Said the man looked at you like you hung the moon." "Millie has always had an overactive imagination," Grace replied, turning back to her preparations to hide her flustered expression. "And I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't spread rumors. It would be inappropriate for a teacher to be the subject of town gossip." Penny looked slightly chastened. "Of course, though I don't see why you'd mind. Rylan Ingram is quite a catch, owns the biggest ranch this side of the territory, treats his workers fair, and devoted to that boy of his. Not to mention," she fanned herself dramatically, "he cuts a fine figure on horseback." Despite herself, Grace smiled. "I'm sure Mr. Ingram would be mortified to hear himself discussed this way." "That's just it, he's so modest," Penny sighed. "Unlike some men in this town." She adjusted her shawl. "Well, I should be going. Ma needs me at the post office." At the door, she paused. "He's a good man, Grace, after what happened with Lieutenant Wilson. Well, it might be nice to allow yourself some happiness." The mention of her late fiancé sobered Grace instantly. "Thank you for delivering the slate, Penny," she said quietly. Alone again, Grace sank into her chair, fingers absently tracing the wood grain of her desk. 2 years had passed since Benjamin Wilson's death, yet sometimes the grief felt as fresh as the day the telegram arrived. They'd had plans: a small house near the fort, children, a life together. All shattered by a stray bullet during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. Could she truly open herself to that kind of loss again? And yet, The memory of Rylan Ingram's earnest expression as his son embarrassed him brought an involuntary smile to her face. There had been something refreshingly genuine about him, a quiet strength that reminded her of the mountains surrounding their valley, steadfast and unwavering. The sound of children's voices outside pulled her from her reverie. Standing, she smoothed her skirts and pushed thoughts of Rylan Ingram to the back of her mind. She had students to teach and a classroom to run. Romance and its complications would have to wait. But that evening, as she walked home to the small cabin she rented from the Wilsons, her would-be-in-laws who had insisted she stay, when she arrived to plan a wedding that would never happen, her thoughts returned to the widowed rancher and his earnest son. For the first time in 2 years, Grace found herself considering the possibility that her heart wasn't as firmly closed as she'd believed. The harvest social arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and trees painted in gold and crimson. The town square had been transformed with lanterns hanging from every available branch, trestle tables laden with the bounty of fall harvests, and a wooden platform cleared for dancing. Grace stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, critically assessing her appearance. She'd spent the afternoon washing and styling her chestnut hair, pinning it in a more elaborate arrangement than her usual practical teacher's bun. The dress she wore, a deep blue calico with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, had remained unworn in her trunk since arriving in Whispering Pines. It had been meant for socials and dances with Benjamin on her arm. "You look beautiful," said Alina Wilson from the doorway. The older woman's eyes misted slightly as she stepped into the room. "Benjamin would have wanted you to wear it." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "Are you certain?" "I don't want to dishonor his memory." Alina took Grace's hands in her weathered ones. "My son loved life and he loved seeing you happy. 2 years is a long time to mourn, dear heart. He wouldn't want you to be alone forever." Blinking back tears, Grace embraced the woman who should have become her mother-in-law. "Thank you," she whispered. Alina patted her back. "Now, Richard and I will meet you at the social. Don't be too late. I hear there's a certain rancher who's been asking if you'll be attending." Grace pulled back, startled. "Mr. Ingram spoke to you. Came by the general store yesterday," Alina confirmed with a twinkle in her eye. "Asked Richard if we thought you'd truly attend or if you were just being polite. My husband told him you're not one to make promises you don't intend to keep." Warmth bloomed in Grace's chest. The thought of Rylan checking with the Wilsons, the closest thing she had to family here, showed a consideration that touched her deeply. "He seems like a good man," Alina added gently. "And that boy of his needs a mother's love." "It's just a dance," Grace protested weakly. Alina smiled knowingly. "Of course it is, dear." She adjusted her shawl. "We'll see you there." After Alina left, Grace turned back to the mirror, pinching color into her cheeks and taking a deep, steadying breath. "Just a dance," she repeated to herself, wondering why it felt like so much more. The social was in full swing when Grace arrived. Lantern light bathed the square in a warm glow, fiddle music filled the air, and the laughter of her neighbors created a joyful backdrop. She greeted several parents of her students, accepted a cup of cider from Mrs. Peterson, and tried not to obviously search the crowd for a certain cowboy and his son. "Miss Collins, Miss Collins." The excited voice preceded Thomas Ingram as he weaved through the crowd toward her. He was dressed in his Sunday best, hair slicked down in a valiant but failing attempt to tame his cowlicks. "You came." Grace smiled warmly at her newest student, who had proven himself bright and enthusiastic during his first week of school. "Of course I did, Thomas. I promised, didn't I?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Pa said you would, but he's been nervous all the same. Made us leave real early to make sure we wouldn't be late." then had to change his shirt twice because he got dust on the first one. He leaned closer and whispered loudly, "And he used fancy hair tonic that smells like pine trees." "Did he now?" Grace bit back a laugh, charmed by the boy's innocent betrayals of his father's preparations. "Thomas Ingram," came a deep voice from behind the boy. "What have I told you about overwhelming Miss Collins with your chatter?" Grace looked up to find Rylan approaching, and her breath caught slightly. The rugged rancher had transformed into a striking gentleman. His usually untamed hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, and his clothes, while not flashy, were well-tailored and showed off his broad shoulders to advantage. Most compelling, however, was the nervous anticipation in his eyes as they met hers. "Good evening, Mr. Ingram," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Miss Collins." He removed his hat, revealing that he had indeed used hair tonic. "You look—" He paused, seeming to search for a word grand enough before settling on "beautiful." The simple sincerity of his compliment warmed her more than elaborate flattery might have. "Thank you. You clean up quite nicely yourself." A slow smile spread across his face. High praise, coming from someone who's only seen me covered in ranch dust. Thomas tugged at his father's sleeve. "Pa, ask her now before somebody else does." Rylan cleared his throat, shooting his son a look that promised a later discussion about patience. "Miss Collins, would you do me the honor of this dance?" As if on cue, the musicians struck up a waltz. Grace set down her cider cup and offered her hand. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Ingram, though I remind you about my 2 left feet." His large hand enveloped hers, calloused but gentle. "I'll risk it if you will." As he led her toward the dancing platform, she glanced back to see Thomas watching with unabashed satisfaction, giving her a thumbs up when he caught her eye. The boy's transparent matchmaking should have embarrassed her, but instead, Grace found herself charmed by his earnest desire to see his father happy. Rylan proved to be a better dancer than he'd claimed. His movements were sure and confident as he guided her through the waltz, one large hand respectfully at her waist, the other holding hers with surprising gentleness. "You've been practicing," she accused lightly, his cheeks colored slightly beneath his tan. "Thomas might have convinced our housekeeper, Mrs. Fernsby, to give me a few pointers. That boy's determined to see me make a good impression on you." "He's certainly your biggest supporter," Grace observed, feeling surprisingly comfortable in his arms. "You've raised a wonderful son, Mr. Ingram." A shadow passed over his face. "I wish I could take full credit, but Thomas has a good heart despite my fumbling attempts at parenting. His mother would have done a far better job." Grace's expression softened. "I think you're too hard on yourself. Thomas clearly adores you." "He's a forgiving soul." Rylan guided her through a gentle turn, "much like his mother was." "Would you tell me about her?" Grace asked softly, then hurried to add, "Only if you'd like to, of course." Rylan was quiet for several steps, and Grace feared she'd overstepped. But when he spoke, his voice was steady if subdued. "Her name was Sarah. We met in St. Louis when I was delivering horses to a buyer there. She was the daughter of a merchant, educated, refined, everything I wasn't." His lips curved in a fond, sad smile. "But for some reason, she saw something in me worth loving. We married after a whirlwind courtship, and I brought her west to my uncle's ranch in Wyoming." "That must have been a difficult adjustment for her," Grace observed. Rylan nodded. "It was, but Sarah never complained. She made our cabin a home, learned to cook over an open hearth, even helped with the horses. When she told me she was expecting Thomas, it was the happiest day of my life." His voice dropped lower. "And then the hardest, just 9 months later." His arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her as the music continued. "The birth was difficult. By the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. She lived just long enough to name him and make me promise to raise him right. Grace's heart ached for him. I'm so sorry, Rylan. The use of his first name slipped out naturally, and neither of them remarked on it. 8 years ago now, he said. After she passed, I couldn't bear to stay at the ranch we'd shared, so Thomas and I moved around for a while. When my uncle died and left me the double R, it seemed like a chance to put down roots again. The music drew to a close, but they remained standing close, the shared intimacy of their conversation binding them in place as other couples moved around them. "And you, Grace?" Rylan asked gently. "The Wilsons told me about their son. I'm sorry for your loss." Grace swallowed, touched that he'd approached the subject with such care. "Benjamin and I were to be married. He was stationed at Fort Harrison. We'd known each other since we were children. Our families were neighbors in Pennsylvania." The familiar ache returned, but duller now with time. "He died in a skirmish with raiders 2 years ago." Rylan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Is that why you came west, to be near his parents?" "Yes," Grace confirmed. "I'd already accepted the teaching position here, planning to start after our wedding, when the telegram came." She took a steadying breath. "The Wilsons insisted I still come. Said Benjamin would have wanted me to keep my promise to the town. They've been my family ever since." "They're good people," Rylan said, "and they clearly think the world of you." The musicians began tuning for another song, breaking the moment. Rylan reluctantly stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand. "Would you like some refreshment? Mrs. Peterson's apple cider is legendary." Grace smiled, grateful for his sensitivity. "I'd love some, and perhaps we should check on Thomas. I suspect he's monitoring our progress quite closely." Rylan chuckled, the sound warming her. "No doubt plotting his next move. That boy's determined to see me settled again." As they moved off the dance floor, his hand found the small of her back. The touch light but steady, much like the man himself, Grace realized. And for the first time since receiving that terrible telegram, she found herself genuinely curious about what the future might hold. Throughout the evening, Grace and Rylan shared 2 more dances, sampled Mrs. Peterson's famous apple pie, and discovered numerous common interests, from a love of poetry to a shared fascination with the natural wonders of the territory. Thomas hovered nearby, transparently pleased with each laugh he elicited from Grace or approving nod he received from his father. As the night drew to a close, families with young children began departing, and Thomas's valiant efforts to suppress his yawns became less successful. "I believe someone is ready for bed," Grace observed gently as the boy's eyes drooped during a lull in conversation. "I'm not tired," Thomas protested automatically, even as he rubbed his eyes. "Are you going to walk Miss Collins home, Pa?" Rylan shot his son a look that was half exasperation, half fondness. "If Miss Collins would like an escort, I'd be honored to provide one. But first, I think a certain young man needs to say his goodnights." Thomas reluctantly nodded, then surprised Grace by throwing his arms around her waist in a spontaneous hug. "Thank you for dancing with Pa," he whispered. "He hasn't smiled this much since forever." Touched, Grace returned the embrace, smoothing his unruly hair. "I enjoyed every minute, Thomas." "You have a wonderful father." The boy beamed up at her. "He's the best pa in the territory, and he makes really good pancakes on Sundays." Rylan cleared his throat, color rising in his cheeks. "Thomas, why don't you go say goodbye to your friends? I'll meet you at the wagon in a few minutes." Once Thomas had scampered off, Rylan turned to Grace. "I apologize for his enthusiasm. Since we settled at the double R, he's become fixated on the idea that I need a wife." "There's nothing to apologize for," Grace assured him. "He's a delightful boy who loves his father." "That's something to be proud of." Ryland's expression softened. "I'd be honored to walk you home if you'd allow it. I've arranged for Mrs. Fernsby to take Thomas back to the ranch." Grace glanced around the square, noting that the Wilsons had already departed. "I'd appreciate the escort, thank you." After Ryland settled Thomas in the care of a motherly woman with silver-streaked hair, he returned to offer Grace his arm. They departed the social amid knowing smiles from the remaining townsfolk, walking in comfortable silence until they'd left the glow of the lanterns behind. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Their path was illuminated by moonlight, casting long shadows as they walked toward the modest house at the edge of town where Grace resided. "I've enjoyed this evening more than any in recent memory," Ryland said, breaking the silence. "Thank you for the dances." Grace smiled up at him. "I should be thanking you. It's been a long time since I allowed myself to simply enjoy an evening like this." "Grief has a way of making us forget how to live," Ryland observed softly. "It took me years to remember there might be joy on the other side of loss." The perceptiveness of his comment struck Grace deeply. "Yes, exactly. It feels almost like a betrayal, sometimes to laugh or to look forward when someone you loved can't." Ryland nodded, his profile strong in the moonlight. "Sarah's father told me something after she died that I've held on to. He said, the greatest honor you can give the dead is to truly live." I didn't understand it, then could barely hear it through my grief. But as Thomas grew, I began to see the wisdom in it. They reached the gate of the Wilson home, pausing beneath the sprawling oak that shaded the front yard. Grace turned to face him, still holding his arm. "Your father-in-law was a wise man," she said. "Benjamin was like that too, always finding joy in small moments. He used to say life was too short not to dance when music played." Ryland's expression was thoughtful as he gazed down at her. "Would he approve of you dancing with a rough around the edges rancher?" Grace considered this, then smiled. "He'd like that you asked the question, and yes, I think he would. Benjamin wanted my happiness above all else. A good man, then. As are you, Ryland Ingram." The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. Ryland took a step closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the night. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "I'd like to call on you properly if you'd allow it. No pretense of school business or harvest socials. Just a man asking to spend time with a woman he finds remarkable." Her heart quickened at his directness. "I'd like that very much." Relief and joy mingled in his expression. Slowly, telegraphing his intentions to give her time to withdraw, Ryland leaned down. His lips brushed her cheek, a feather-light touch that somehow carried more meaning than any passionate embrace could have. "Good night, Grace Collins," he murmured near her ear. "Dream well." "Good night, Ryland," she whispered back, her hand briefly squeezing his before she turned toward the house. At the door, she looked back to find him still standing by the gate, hat in hand, watching to ensure she entered safely. Grace raised her hand in a final farewell before stepping inside, her cheek still warm where his lips had touched it, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The weeks that followed the harvest social brought a gradual but unmistakable courtship. Ryland began appearing at the schoolhouse after classes, sometimes alone, sometimes with Thomas, always with a thoughtful gesture: wildflowers gathered from the prairie, a basket of fresh apples from the ranch's small orchard, or a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Their conversations deepened with each meeting, moving beyond polite exchanges to revealing confidences. Grace learned about Ryland's childhood in Kansas, his years as a horse trader before settling down, and his dreams for the Double R Ranch. In turn, she shared stories of her Pennsylvania upbringing, her journey west with teaching credentials and wedding plans, and the healing she'd found in educating the children of Whispering Pines. Thomas, delighted by the developing relationship, appointed himself their official chaperone, though he often became conveniently distracted by nearby butterflies or interesting rocks when his father and teacher fell into more personal conversations. On a crisp November afternoon, Grace dismissed her students early so they could help their families prepare for the Thanksgiving festivities later that week. As the last child disappeared down the dusty road, she began her usual routine of cleaning the blackboard and straightening desks, humming softly to herself. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart leap in a now familiar way. Smoothing her hair, she moved to the doorway just as Ryland dismounted from his chestnut stallion. "This is a pleasant surprise," she called, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "I thought you'd be busy with ranch preparations for winter." Ryland removed his hat as he approached, a smile warming his weathered features. "The men have things well in hand. I thought you might enjoy a ride before the weather turns. There's a spot on the ridge overlooking the valley that's particularly beautiful this time of day." Grace considered the stack of essays awaiting her attention, then looked at Ryland's hopeful expression. "The papers could wait. I'd love that. Let me get my shawl." Minutes later, she found herself seated sideways on his horse, Ryland's steady presence behind her as they rode away from the schoolhouse. The proximity was both thrilling and comfortable, a contradiction that seemed to define their evolving relationship. "Thomas not with you today?" she asked as they followed a trail leading toward the foothills. "He's helping Mrs. Fernsby prepare for Thanksgiving. Apparently, he's determined to bake a pie all by himself this year." Ryland's chuckle vibrated against her back. "Heaven help us all," Grace laughed. "He's quite the determined young man. Just yesterday, he insisted on solving an arithmetic problem meant for the older children and succeeded." "He's blossoming under your teaching," Ryland said, his voice warm with gratitude. Before we came to Whispering Pines, he'd never shown much interest in book learning. Now he races through his chores so he can read whatever new story you've assigned. "He's a bright boy with natural curiosity," Grace replied. "You built that foundation long before he entered my classroom." They fell into comfortable silence as the horse carried them higher into the hills. The terrain changed from the open grasslands surrounding the town to scattered stands of pines and aspen, their leaves a brilliant gold against the evergreens. After 20 minutes of steady climbing, they reached a natural clearing on a ridge. Ryland reined in the horse, then dismounted with fluid grace before reaching up to help Grace down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's beautiful," she said, turning to take in the panoramic view to cover her flustered reaction. And it was. The valley spread below them in a patchwork of autumn colors, the golden browns of harvested fields, the russet and amber of turning leaves, and the silver thread of the river winding through it all. In the distance, Whispering Pines looked like a collection of children's toys, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals against the clear blue sky. Ryland spread a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag on a flat rock overlooking the vista. "I found this place when I first arrived," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "It helped me feel settled, somehow seeing the whole valley laid out like this, knowing Thomas and I were part of something larger." Grace settled beside him, drawing her shawl closer against the crisp air. "I understand. When I first arrived, I used to walk to the edge of town each evening and look toward the mountains. It made me feel less alone, being held in their shadow." Ryland nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Grace," he began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. These past weeks have meant more to me than I can properly express." She turned toward him, heart quickening at the seriousness in his tone. "They've meant a great deal to me as well." His hand found hers on the blanket, strong fingers intertwining with her slender ones. "I need to be honest with you. When Thomas and I came to your schoolhouse that day, it wasn't just about enrolling him. I'd seen you in town, at church, at community gatherings. I'd noticed your kindness with the children, the way you spoke with such passion about education, how you never turned away anyone in need of help." His eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. "I wanted to know you better, but I didn't know how to approach you without seeming presumptuous." "So you used your son as an excuse," Grace teased gently, though deeply touched by his admission. A rueful smile crossed his face. "Thomas suggested it, actually. He said, 'Pa, if you want to talk to the teacher lady, why don't you just take me to school out of the mouths of babes?'" Grace laughed softly. Wise beyond his years, that one. Indeed. Ryland's thumb traced gentle patterns on her hand. "I didn't expect to feel this way again, Grace. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. I'd be a father to Thomas, a steward of the land, but never again a man who could offer his heart to a woman." Grace swallowed, understanding exactly what he meant. "I felt the same after Benjamin, as if loving once was all I was allotted in this life. And now?" Ryland asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She met his gaze steadily. "Now I find myself wondering if perhaps the heart has more capacity than we give it credit for. If maybe it can heal and grow and love again, differently perhaps, but no less truly." Something like hope blazed in Ryland's eyes. Slowly, he raised their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Grace Collins, I'm falling in love with you. I don't expect you to say it back. I know we're still learning each other, still finding our way. But I wanted you to know that my intentions are serious and my feelings sincere." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, not of sadness, but of a complicated joy, the kind that comes when something long thought lost is unexpectedly recovered. "Ryland," she said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The confession hung between them like something precious and fragile. Then, with deliberate gentleness, Ryland leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, then deepening as Grace responded, her free hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally drew apart, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, bathing the valley in golden light. Ryland's expression was one of wonder and gratitude. "I should get you back before dark," he said reluctantly. "But Grace, thank you for your honesty, for your courage in opening your heart again." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Thank you for showing me it was possible." As they rode back down the trail, Grace leaned back against Ryland's solid chest, his arms secure around her as he held the reins. The future stretched before them, uncertain as all futures must be, but now filled with possibilities she'd long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. Winter descended upon Whispering Pines with a series of heavy snowfalls that transformed the landscape into a glistening white wonderland. The schoolhouse remained open despite the weather, though attendance fluctuated depending on road conditions and ranch responsibilities. Thomas Ingram, however, never missed a day, proudly arriving on his pony alongside his father whenever possible. December brought preparations for the town's Christmas celebration. Grace enlisted her students' help in decorating the schoolhouse with paper chains and pine boughs, planning a holiday recital for parents and townspeople. Ryland contributed by building a small stage at the front of the classroom, working evenings after his ranch duties were complete. On one such evening, with Thomas absorbed in practicing his recitation piece in a corner. Rylan and Grace worked side by side, hanging evergreen garlands around the windows. "The Wilsons have invited us for Christmas dinner," Grace mentioned as she passed Rylan another length of twine. "Thomas too, of course. They said it was high time they got to know you properly." Rylan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what prompted this sudden interest in my character?" Grace felt color rise in her cheeks. "I may have mentioned you during our Sunday visits more often than I realized. Alina says I light up like a lantern when I speak your name." A slow smile spread across Rylan's face. "Do you now? That's mighty interesting information, Miss Collins." "Don't let it go to your head, Mr. Ingram," she retorted, though her smile matched his. "I've accepted on our behalf, if that's agreeable to you." "More than agreeable." His voice softened. "It means a great deal that Benjamin's parents have welcomed our friendship." Grace considered how to respond. What existed between them had grown beyond friendship, though they'd been careful to maintain propriety in public. Their private moments, walks after school, Sunday afternoon rides, evenings by the fire at the Double R when Mrs. Fernsby served as chaperone, had been filled with increasingly open expressions of affection and plans that extended further into the future with each conversation. "They want me to be happy," she said simply. "They see that you and Thomas bring me joy." Ryland's expression grew serious as he stepped down from the chair he'd been standing on. "Do we, truly?" Grace moved closer, glancing toward Thomas, who remained engrossed in his recitation. "You know you do," she said softly. "More than I thought possible again." He reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek. "When I brought Thomas to enroll in school, I hoped we might become friends. I never dared dream we'd find this." "Nor I," Grace admitted. "But I'm grateful every day that you gathered your courage to approach the schoolhouse that afternoon." The tenderness in Ryland's eyes made her heart swell. For a moment, it seemed he might kiss her, but a triumphant whoop from Thomas broke the moment. "I remembered it all," the boy exclaimed, rushing toward them. "Every single word of the night before Christmas. Wait until everyone hears me at the recital," Grace laughed, turning her attention to her enthusiastic pupil. "That's wonderful, Thomas. Your hard work is paying off. Pa, did you hear me?" Thomas looked up at his father expectantly. "Every word, son," Rylan assured him, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll be the star of the show." Thomas beamed, then looked between the two adults with sudden suspicion. "Were you two having a private moment, Mrs. Fernsby says I should make myself scarce when you get that look in your eyes." "Mrs. Fernsby talks too much," Rylan muttered, while Grace bit her lip to suppress a laugh. "We were discussing Christmas plans," she explained to Thomas. "How would you feel about having dinner with the Wilsons?" Thomas considered this. "Will there be pie?" "Knowing Alina Wilson, there will be at least 3 kinds," Grace promised. "Then I accept," Thomas said solemnly, before adding, "Pa's been carving something in the barn every night after he thinks I'm asleep. I bet it's Christmas presents." Rylan cleared his throat. "Thomas, why don't you practice your recitation once more while I finish these garlands with Miss Collins?" The boy grinned knowingly before skipping back to his corner, leaving Rylan and Grace exchanging amused glances. "That boy misses nothing," Rylan sighed. "He's observant," Grace agreed. "And apparently you've been keeping secrets in the barn." Rylan's expression turned enigmatic. "Perhaps. Christmas is a time for surprises, after all." The night of the school recital arrived with perfect winter weather, just enough snow to make everything festive, but clear skies that allowed families from outlying ranches to attend. The schoolhouse was filled to capacity, extra benches brought in from the church to accommodate everyone. Grace stood at the front, heart swelling with pride as her students performed their pieces one by one. Thomas delivered his recitation flawlessly, his clear voice ringing out across the room, his eyes finding his father's for reassurance during the longer passages. When the program concluded, the community broke into enthusiastic applause. Parents crowded forward to congratulate their children, and tables at the back were quickly laden with holiday treats brought by each family. In the happy chaos, Grace found herself momentarily alone, watching the community she'd grown to love celebrating together. "You've done something remarkable here," came Ryland's voice as he appeared at her side. "Look at them ranchers and townspeople, old settlers and newcomers, all united because of what you've built in this schoolhouse." Grace shook her head modestly. "I merely provided the occasion. They created the community long before I arrived." "You underestimate your influence," he insisted gently. "This town has changed since you came to teach. There's more unity, more purpose. The children bring their learning home and it spreads like ripples in a pond." Before she could respond, Thomas bounded up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see me, Miss Collins? I didn't forget a single word. You were magnificent," Grace assured him, bending slightly to straighten his collar. "I couldn't be prouder." "Pa said we could go sledding tomorrow if the weather holds," Thomas continued breathlessly. "Will you come? There's a perfect hill behind our house." Grace glanced at Ryland, who nodded encouragement. "I'd love to, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me." The boy beamed, then spotted one of his friends across the room. "Can I go have cookies with Jimmy?" "Go ahead," Ryland chuckled. "But mind your manners." As Thomas darted away, Ryland turned back to Grace. "I hope you don't mind the invitation. He's been planning to ask you all week." "I don't mind at all," she assured him. "Though I should warn you, I haven't been sledding since I was a girl in Pennsylvania." "All the more reason to reacquaint yourself with the joy of it," Ryland replied, his eyes warm. "Besides, I've become quite adept at catching falling teachers." The teasing reference to her stumble during a nature walk the previous month made Grace laugh. "Very funny, Mr. Ingram. I'll have you know I'm quite graceful on a sled." "I look forward to witnessing this hidden talent," he said, his smile deepening the creases around his eyes in a way she'd come to adore. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alina and Richard Wilson, who embraced Grace warmly before turning to Ryland. "That was a fine program, Miss Collins," Richard said, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Reminded me of the Christmas pageants back east." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. The children worked very hard." Alina linked her arm through Grace's. "And your Thomas was exceptional, Mr. Ingram." "Such poise for one so young." "He takes after his mother in that regard," Ryland replied, a hint of old sorrow momentarily shadowing his eyes. "She had a gift for public speaking." "Well, he does you both credit," Alina said kindly. "Now, Grace, I hope you'll stop by tomorrow to help me plan the Christmas dinner menu. Mr. Ingram has informed us that he and Thomas have some dietary preferences we should consider." Grace looked questioningly at Ryland, who shrugged with a small smile. "Thomas mentioned his fondness for cranberry sauce. I merely suggested it might be a welcome addition to the table." "Cranberry sauce it shall be then," Alina declared. "Now, Richard, I believe Mrs. Peterson is trying to catch your eye about that woodworking project." As the Wilsons moved away, Ryland stepped closer to Grace, lowering his voice. "They're good people. I see why you love them." "They've been my family when I had none," Grace agreed softly. "Their acceptance of you and Thomas means everything to me." Ryland's expression grew tender. "Grace, Pa, Miss Collins." Thomas's voice cut through the crowd as he rushed back toward them. "Mrs. Peterson says it's starting to snow again. We should head back to the ranch before the roads get bad." Ryland sighed, the moment broken, but squeezed Grace's hand reassuringly. We should indeed. Grace, can we offer you a ride home? The wagon has plenty of room. Thank you, but I promised to help with the cleanup, she declined reluctantly. The Wilsons will see me home safely. Then we'll come for you around midday tomorrow, Ryland said. For sledding. I'll be ready, she promised. Dress warmly, Thomas. We can't have our star reciter catching cold. The boy nodded seriously. I'll wear 2 scarves if Pa says I need to. Ryland laughed, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. One will suffice, I think. He turned back to Grace, his expression conveying what he couldn't say aloud in the crowded room. Until tomorrow, Miss Collins. Until tomorrow, Mr. Ingram, she replied, her heart full as she watched father and son make their way through the crowd toward the door. The sledding expedition proved to be a day of pure joy. Thomas demonstrated his considerable skills on the wooden sled Ryland had crafted, while Grace rediscovered the exhilarating rush of speeding down a snowy hillside. Ryland joined them for several runs before claiming a spot at the top of the hill, content to watch his son, and the woman he loved filling the winter air with laughter. As Christmas approached, Grace found herself drawn more deeply into the Ingram family's holiday traditions. She helped Thomas select the perfect pine tree for their ranch house, taught him to make paper snowflakes for decorations, and spent an afternoon baking cookies with him and Mrs. Fernsby in the warm, fragrant kitchen. Throughout it all, her relationship with Ryland deepened. Their conversations ranged from philosophical discussions about education and ranching to sharing childhood memories and future dreams. Each revelation, each moment of vulnerability, strengthened the bond between them. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the sun casting diamond sparkles across the pristine snow. Grace attended the morning church service, her heart warming as Ryland and Thomas slid into the pew beside her, both dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas proudly presented her with a small, clumsily wrapped package, a pinecone ornament he'd decorated himself, painted gold and adorned with tiny red berries. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "I'll treasure it always." Later, at the Wilson home, the holiday dinner exceeded all expectations. Eleanor had outdone herself with a feast that included a succulent roast, Thomas's beloved cranberry sauce, and 3 different pies. The conversation flowed easily, Richard regaling them with stories of Benjamin's childhood exploits, Eleanor drawing Thomas out about his school experiences, and Ryland discussing spring plans for the Double R Ranch. As twilight approached and Thomas dozed by the fire, content after too much dessert, Ryland suggested a short walk to help settle their meal. Grace readily agreed, and with Eleanor's knowing smile following them, they bundled up and stepped out into the winter evening. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked arm in arm down the quiet street. Christmas candles glowed in windows, and the occasional burst of laughter from celebrating families drifted through the cold air. "This has been the happiest Christmas I've had in years," Ryland confessed as they reached the town square, deserted now as families gathered in their homes. Seeing Thomas so joyful, being welcomed by the Wilsons, sharing the day with you, it's more than I dared hope for when we arrived in Whispering Pines. Grace leaned against him slightly, drawing warmth from his solid presence. "For me as well. Last Christmas, I went through the motions for Eleanor and Richard's sake, but my heart wasn't truly in the celebration. This year feels different, as if I've remembered how to embrace joy again." Ryland stopped walking, turning to face her. In the glow of moonlight reflected off snow, his expression was solemn yet filled with tenderness. "Grace, I have something for you, a Christmas gift I wanted to give you privately." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box, exquisitely carved with intricate patterns of intertwining roses, the secret project Thomas had mentioned. "You made this," Grace breathed, running her fingertips over the delicate workmanship. "I did. Open it, please." With slightly trembling fingers, Grace lifted the lid. Nestled on a cushion of soft velvet lay a silver locket, simple yet elegant in design. She gasped softly, looking up at Rylan in surprise. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "One of the few things I have from her. My father gave it to her on their wedding day." The significance of the gift was not lost on Grace. "Rylan, it's too precious. I couldn't possibly." "Please," he interrupted gently. "I want you to have it, not just as a keepsake, but as a promise." He took her gloved hands in his. "Grace Collins, these past months have shown me that life can offer second chances at happiness. You've brought light back into my world, into Thomas's world. I love you wholly, completely, with every part of my being." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. Rylan's face transformed with happiness. He reached for the locket, carefully removing it from the box. "May I?" Grace nodded, turning so he could place it around her neck. The metal was cool against her skin as it settled just above her heart. When she turned back to face him, Rylan took both her hands again, his expression now serious. "There's something else I want to ask you," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Something I've been considering for some time now." Grace's heart began to race as she recognized the gravity in his tone. "I know it hasn't been long, by conventional standards," Rylan continued. "But I think when you've experienced loss, as we both have, you learn to recognize true happiness when you find it again. I don't want to waste a single day we could spend building a life together." He drew a deep breath. "Grace Collins, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of becoming Thomas's mother? Of making our family complete?" The world seemed to still around them, the moonlight, the snow, the distant sounds of celebration all fading as Grace absorbed his words. In her mind flashed images of Benjamin, of the future they'd planned but never realized. Yet instead of pain, she felt a gentle peace, as if receiving a blessing from beyond. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, Rylan, I will marry you." Joy blazed across his face as he gathered her into his arms, lifting her slightly off the ground in his enthusiasm. When he set her down, his hands framed her face with infinite tenderness before he kissed her a kiss that spoke of promises, of futures, of family and home. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Rylan pressed his forehead to hers. "Thomas will be ecstatic. He's been hoping for this since the day we met you." Grace laughed softly. "That boy has been matchmaking from the start." "He has excellent taste," Rylan murmured, kissing her again briefly before offering his arm to escort her back to the Wilson home. "When shall we tell him? And the Wilsons?" "Tonight," Grace decided. "It's Christmas, after all, a time for joy and new beginnings." As they walked back through the quiet town, snowflakes began to fall gently around them, as if nature itself were blessing their engagement. Grace touched the locket at her throat, feeling as though her heart might burst with happiness. The months that followed their Christmas engagement passed in a flurry of preparations and planning. Grace continued teaching, though she'd given notice that she would complete the school year before retiring to become Mrs. Ingram. The school board had already begun interviewing potential replacements, though Grace insisted on having input in the selection process, determined that her students would be left in capable hands. At the Double R, Rylan and Thomas, with Mrs. Fernsby's enthusiastic assistants, prepared for Grace to join their household. The master bedroom received fresh paint and curtains. The kitchen was reorganized to Grace's preferences, and Thomas insisted on planting a flower garden outside her window. So Ma will have something pretty to look at every morning. The use of Ma had begun tentatively at first, with Thomas asking permission one evening as Grace helped him with his homework at the ranch. "Miss Collins," he'd begun, unusually hesitant, "when you marry Pa, what should I call you? I never knew my real Ma, so it wouldn't be like I'm replacing her, would it?" Grace had set aside the arithmetic slate, giving the question her full attention. "What would you like to call me, Thomas?" The boy had fidgeted with a pencil. "Well, Jimmy Carson calls his stepmother Mrs. Carson, but that seems awful formal for family. And Grace doesn't seem right either, since you're going to be my Ma in all the ways that matter." His earnest expression had melted her heart. "I would be honored if you wanted to call me Ma," she'd said softly. "And no, it wouldn't be replacing your mother. You can keep her in your heart while still allowing me a place there too. Hearts are wonderfully expandable that way." Thomas had considered this seriously before breaking into a wide smile. "I like that, and I think my real Ma would like it too. Pa says she was always worried about him raising me alone." From that day forward, Ma had become Thomas's name for her, each utterance cementing their growing bond as mother and son. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June, when the prairie would be ablaze with wildflowers and the school year complete. Eleanor Wilson had taken charge of the preparations, enlisting half the women in town to help with the festivities. The ceremony would take place in the church, followed by a celebration in the town square that promised to be the social event of the season. As the date approached, Grace divided her time between concluding her teaching responsibilities, finalizing wedding details, and gradually moving her personal belongings to the ranch. With each visit to what would soon be her home, the reality of the impending change in her life became more tangible and more joyful. One evening in late May, just a week before the wedding, Grace arrived at the Double R to find Rylan waiting for her on the porch, his expression unusually serious. "What is it?" she asked as he helped her down from the buggy she'd driven out from town. "Has something happened?" Rylan shook his head, taking her hand. "Nothing's wrong, but there's something I need to show you, something important before you commit to this life with us." Curious and slightly concerned, Grace allowed him to lead her past the main house toward a stand of pines at the edge of the property. As they approached, she noticed a small cleared area she hadn't seen before, and within it, a simple wooden cross. "Sarah's grave," Rylan said quietly, stopping at a respectful distance. "When we settled here, I had her remains brought from Wyoming. I wanted Thomas to have a place to visit his mother, to know she was still part of our family even if she couldn't be with us." Grace squeezed his hand in understanding. "Thank you for showing me. I wanted you to know that she'll always have a place here in our land and in our memories," Rylan continued. "But I also wanted you to know that my heart is fully yours now, Grace. I've made my peace with the past." Deeply moved, Grace stepped forward, drawing Rylan with her until they stood before the grave. "Sarah," she said softly, "I promise to cherish the family you created, to love your son as my own, to honor your memory by bringing joy to those you loved." Rylan's arm slipped around her waist, holding her close as the evening breeze rustled through the pines. "She would have liked you," he murmured. "Your strength, your kindness, your dedication to teaching." "I wish I could have known her," Grace replied honestly. "But I'm grateful that part of her lives on in Thomas, and in the man you became through loving her." They stood together in companionable silence until the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As they walked back toward the house, where Thomas waited with excitement to show Grace his latest school project, she felt a sense of completion of past and present merging into a future bright with promise. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union. Grace dressed in Eleanor Wilson's sitting room, the older woman helping her into the ivory gown they'd spent months creating. The design was elegant but practical silk overlaid with delicate lace, high-necked but with feminine details that complemented Grace's slender figure. "You look beautiful, my dear," Eleanor said, her eyes misting as she adjusted the small wreath of wildflowers that crowned Grace's upswept hair. Absolutely radiant, Grace turned to embrace the woman who had become her surrogate mother. "Thank you for everything. For welcoming me when I arrived with a broken heart, for encouraging me to live again, for supporting my love for Rylan." Eleanor patted her back, careful not to wrinkle the dress. "Benjamin would be so happy for you. He only ever wanted your joy." "I know," Grace said softly, fingering the locket that had rarely left her neck since Christmas night. Inside, she had placed a tiny photograph of Benjamin on one side and a small family portrait of Rylan and Thomas on the other, her past and future united in one precious keepsake. A knock at the door preceded Richard Wilson's entrance. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily speechless at the sight of Grace in her wedding finery. "Well now," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion, "isn't that a vision to gladden an old man's heart?" Grace crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Thank you for agreeing to give me away today. It means everything to have your blessing." Richard cleared his throat. "It's my honor, child, and I know Benjamin is smiling down on us today." He offered his arm. "Now, there's a mighty nervous rancher waiting at the altar and a young boy who's been bouncing with excitement since dawn. Shall we put them out of their misery?" Grace laughed, the sound bright with happiness as she took his arm. "Lead on, Mr. Wilson." The church was filled to capacity when they arrived, every resident of Whispering Pines and surrounding ranches having turned out for the celebration. As the small ensemble of musicians began playing, Grace took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway on Richard's arm. The assembled guests rose to their feet, faces turning to watch her progress. But Grace had eyes only for the two figures waiting at the altar: Rylan, handsome and solemn in his best suit, and beside him, Thomas, standing tall and proud in his role as best man, his face split in a grin that threatened to outshine the June sun. As she moved slowly down the aisle, Grace felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was her family now, not replacing what she had lost, but building something new and beautiful from the foundation of shared experiences, mutual respect, and deep, abiding love. When she reached the altar, Richard placed her hand in Rylan's with a meaningful nod before taking his seat beside his wife. The warmth and strength of Rylan's grip anchored Grace as they turned to face the minister. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and unwavering as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Rylan's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. But it was what happened next that truly cemented their new family. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Rylan motioned for Thomas to step forward. The boy approached, suddenly solemn with the importance of the moment. "Thomas," Rylan said, loud enough for the congregation to hear, "Miss Collins Grace is now officially part of our family, but there's one more thing we need to make it complete." From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box similar to the one he'd given Grace at Christmas, but sized for a child's hands. He presented it to Thomas, who opened it with careful fingers to reveal a silver pocket watch. "This was your grandfather's," Rylan explained. "I've been saving it for an important day. Today seems fitting, as we become a complete family at last." Thomas stared at the watch in awe before looking up at Grace, his expression a mixture of hope and vulnerability that tugged at her heart. Setting the box aside, he took a deep breath and asked in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the church, "Will you marry my pa?" Then, as if suddenly overcome by emotion, he added in a whisper, "And be my ma for real." The unexpected question, so heartfelt, so innocent in its redundancy after the ceremony just concluded, brought tears to Grace's eyes. They spilled down her cheeks before she could answer, emotion momentarily robbing her of speech. In that silent moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Thomas's face. Kneeling down to his level, heedless of her wedding gown against the church floor, Grace cupped his face in her hands. "Yes, Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have married your pa, and I will be your ma for real, for always, with all my heart." Thomas launched himself into her arms, and Rylan knelt beside them, enfolding them both in his embrace as the congregation broke into spontaneous applause and more than a few tears. It was this moment, this simple, profound exchange that would be recounted in family stories for generations to come. How a boy's innocent question had transformed a traditional wedding into something far more meaningful, the true creation of a family. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household. A band played lively tunes that kept the dancing platform filled, and children raced between clusters of adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. As twilight descended, Ryland found his bride sitting at a table with Eleanor Wilson, watching Thomas demonstrate a complicated roping trick to a group of admiring children. "Mrs. Ingram," he said, offering his hand with a formal bow that made her laugh, "may I have this dance?" Grace placed her hand in his, rising gracefully. "You may indeed, Mr. Ingram." As he led her to the dancing platform, Ryland pulled her closer than propriety might strictly allow. "Happy," he murmured near her ear. "Completely," she affirmed, her eyes reflecting the glow of lanterns being lit around the square as darkness fell. "And you, more than I ever thought possible," he replied, guiding her through the steps of a waltz. "Though I must say I'm looking forward to taking my wife home." The warmth in his eyes sent a pleasant shiver through Grace. "As am I." Later, as their friends and neighbors gathered to bid them farewell with good-natured teasing and handfuls of flower petals, Thomas approached with Mrs. Fernsby. "I'm staying in town with Mrs. Fernsby tonight," he informed them importantly. "She says you two need privacy for married people things." The boy's nose wrinkled slightly in confusion. "Though I'm not sure what that means exactly." Ryland coughed to hide his embarrassment while Grace bit her lip to suppress a laugh. Mrs. Fernsby merely looked serenely innocent. "Thank you, Mrs. Fernsby," Grace managed. "We appreciate your thoughtfulness." "Think nothing of it, Mrs. Ingram," the housekeeper replied with a knowing smile. "We'll bring Thomas home tomorrow afternoon. You two enjoy your first day as husband and wife." Kneeling, Grace hugged Thomas tightly. "Thank you for asking me that beautiful question in church today. It meant the world to me." The boy beamed. "Pa said it might be redundant, but I wanted to ask proper since I'm the one who's getting a new ma." "And I'm the one blessed with a wonderful new son," Grace replied, kissing his cheek. "Be good for Mrs. Fernsby, and we'll see you tomorrow." After a final round of congratulations, Rylan helped Grace into their wagon, and they departed amid cheers and well wishes, flower petals clinging to their clothes and hair as they rode into the June evening toward their home, toward their future together. 1 year later, Grace sat on the porch of the Double R Ranch house, a small bundle cradled in her arms as she watched Thomas teaching a young colt to accept a halter under Ryland's watchful supervision. The scene father and son working together beneath a vast Montana sky. Their movements speaking of mutual respect and shared purpose filled her heart with contentment. The infant in her arms stirred, tiny fists waving as she woke from her nap. Sarah Eleanor Ingram had arrived 3 weeks earlier, a healthy, robust daughter with her father's dark hair and her mother's delicate features. "There's my girl," Grace cooed, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Did you have a good sleep? Your brother and father are teaching that colt some manners." "Shall we go see?" Rising carefully, she made her way down the porch steps toward the corral, the familiar weight of her locket tapping gently against her collarbone as she walked. Ryland spotted her approach and handed the lead rope to Thomas before vaulting over the fence to meet her. "How are my favorite ladies?" he asked, gently brushing a finger over the baby's downy head before pressing a kiss to Grace's forehead. "Perfectly content," Grace replied, leaning against his side as they watched Thomas continue the lesson with surprising skill for a 9-year-old. "He's a natural with horses," Ryland observed proudly. "Gets that from his mother's side, I think. Sarah had a way with animals." "He gets many fine qualities from both his parents," Grace said, understanding that Ryland's occasional references to his first wife were not signs of lingering attachment, but his way of honoring her memory for Thomas's sake. Thomas glanced over, noticed their attention, and carefully handed the colt back to a ranch hand before jogging over to join them. "Did you see, Ma? He's learning real fast." His excitement was palpable as he peered at his sister. "Is Sarah awake? Can I hold her?" "Wash your hands first," Grace reminded him. "Then yes, you may hold her." As Thomas raced toward the pump to comply, Ryland slipped his arm around Grace's waist. "You've made him so happy, you know, given him what I never could alone." "We've given each other what we needed," Grace corrected softly. "A complete family. A second chance at happiness." Ryland's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of all they'd found together. "I thank God every day for bringing you into our lives," he murmured against her lips. "As do I," Grace replied, her heart full to overflowing as she gazed at the man she loved, their daughter in her arms, their son running back toward them with clean hands and an eager smile. "As do I." And as the Montana sunset painted the ranch in hues of gold and rose, Grace Ingram knew with absolute certainty that this man, these children, this life they were building together was exactly where she was meant to be. Not despite the losses and sorrows that had led them here, but because of them. For it was in the deepest valleys of grief that they had both learned to cherish the mountaintops of joy and to recognize true love when it unexpectedly appeared, offering healing, hope, and home.